Good evening. Good evening to everyone. I'm Jeff Collins, Professor and Chair of Academic Programs at the Bard Graduate Center. On behalf of all my colleagues, I am delighted to welcome you back to what is, I counted, the 11th year of our Françoise and Georges Selz endowed lectures in French, decorative arts, and culture. A special welcome to those who are joining us by live stream via BGC TV. And you know who you are. I invite you to tweet your questions into us at the address on the screen, Bard Grad Center TV, and we will do our best to relay them as possible to the speaker. And a reminder to everyone, real or virtual, to stay tuned for the other two events of this year's series. The first one on February 24th, when Monica Koplin, who's the director of the Lacquer Museum in Münster, will be coming and talking to us about French lacquer work that goes under the name of Vernis Martin. And then again on the 5th of May, when our own Amy Ogata, formerly of the BGC, returns to this coast to present her new work on metal and metallic culture in France of the 19th century. But to introduce tonight's lecture, I actually want to start with a question. How many of you have made purchases with a credit card in the last 30 days? How many of you used a credit card to buy something today? Okay. Now, in that same period, how many of you made, let's say, a significant purchase by cash or check? Wow, resounding silence. How about like direct debit from your bank account? All right. Well, a little bit more. All right. I'm going to say that credit card wins. And I think that's not surprising. It wins for obviously the same reasons of convenience or cash flow or psychology. Remember J. Wellington Wimpy's famous expression, "I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." And that is where tonight's topic comes in, because if the surge of recent focus among scholars on consumption studies has really convinced us that the 18th century is a turning point in the birth of a consumer society, it's maybe paid less attention to what happened after the moment of sale or the moment of purchase, i.e. the payment. But in 1714, just as in 2014, the payment was often long delayed and not as eagerly made as Wimpy made it sound, especially once the shoes wore out or the fad for whatever fashionable item had been purchased faded like a wave on a beach, only to be replaced by the next dernier cri. And that is what we're going to hear about tonight, the question of how the timetable of fashion intersected with the timetable of credit, dynamic that really conditioned what was made, sold, and consumed in the Ancien Regime. And our guide to this dynamic is Clare Crowston, who is professor and Conrad Humanities Scholar in the Department of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she specializes in the social and cultural history of early modern France, the history of women and gender, the history of work, economic exchange, and consumption. And her first book, entitled Fabricating Women, The Seamstresses of the Old Regime France, 1675 to 1791, won both the Berkshire Prize for the best first book in history by a female scholar in North America and the Hagley Prize in business history. Together with her co-author, Steve Kaplan, she's embarking on a new project on apprenticeship in France, which we were just talking about, from 1670 to 1830, and that's being funded by an ACLS collaborative research fellowship. And there's a third author involved in that, is that right? New third author, ever expanding. So she has contributed to several popular textbooks, including A History of Western Society, A History of World Societies. She's published many book chapters, articles in journals such as French Historical Studies, International Review of Social History, and Annales Histoire Sciences Sociales. And new last year is her most recent monograph, Credit, Fashion, Sex, emphasis on sex, as we were discussing, Economies of Regard in Old Regime France, also Duke University Press. And that is the general area from which you will speak to us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Clare Crowston.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you as well for the invitation to speak in this lecture series. It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to also thank Marc LeBlanc for all of his efforts in organizing the talk. So let me just go to the next slide. Here we go. And so before we get to fashion and credit, we're going to talk a little bit about time, which is the framework in which I'm going to be placing both of those issues this evening. And so we'll begin with this work called Tableau de Paris by an author named Louis-Sébastien Mercier. And in one chapter of this multi-volume, huge book, he provides a vivid account of a day in the life of Paris in the late 1780s. Paris at the time was a city of over 600,000 people. And so the over 1,000 chapters of the book cover a bewildering array of subjects, ranging from convents to cafes, from bankruptcy to booksellers, the latest fashions to royal laws. And in one chapter called How the Day Goes, Mercier describes the activities of different groups of Parisians from the break of dawn into the small hours of the morning. And so he begins at 7 o'clock in the morning with gardeners, this is a quotation, gardeners mounted on their nags and with their baskets empty, heading back out of town again. The only other people around are a few clerks hurrying to their offices. The next round of movement occurs at 9 a.m. As the barbers set out to the houses of the wealthy, and here's a barber shop, as he says, they set out to the houses of the wealthy, wig in one hand, tongs in the other, and waiters in cafes serve breakfast here. At 10 o'clock, he says, a black cloud of lawyers and hangers-on head for the local courts, forming a procession of wigs and gowns and brief bags. Here we have a parody of a contemporary lawyer. At noon, while idlers make their way to the gardens of the Palais Royal, the financial sector is at its height. Stockbrokers hurry to the exchange and to the Rue Saint-Honoré, home to the most important financiers. They're all thronged with customers gathered around to bargain and exchange. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it is dinner time, and properly bewigged gentlemen and finely dressed ladies set out for their invitations, walking on tiptoe so as not to soil their stockings. Calm descends again at 3, Mercier says, because everyone is at dinner. It is not until 5 o'clock that Paris springs back into action. At this time, he says, the din is as though the gates of hell were opened. The streets are clogged with people going to the theater, to the playhouses, or to the cafe. And this frenetic activity subsides once more into calm at 7 o'clock. And Mercier warns that 7 o'clock is the most dangerous time of the day, strangely, especially during the dark and this is because the watch is not yet out, but it's very dark, as many of you know, in Paris at that time, and so thieves seize the opportunity for action. As the night deepens, the crews of the theaters make ready for the evening performances, and Mercier says swarms of other workmen, carpenters, masons, and the like make their way toward the poorer quarter, leaving a trail of white footprints from the plaster attached to their feet. And as they end their long working day in bed, elegant ladies, this is an earlier image, but you get the idea. Elegant ladies are sitting down at their dressing table, as he says, to prepare for the business of the night. At 9 o'clock, these ladies set off to the theater or to make a first round of evening visits. Prostitutes are out on the streets in force, patronized by the husbands of those ladies, who are supposedly out on social calls of their own. And these wealthy married couples meet up again in private homes at 11 o'clock for supper, at the same time as the cafes begin to close and send, as Mercier says, the various idlers and workless and poets back to their garrets for the night. A little after midnight, those of the wealthy classes who don't want to play cards all night go home. The noise of their carriage wheels on the cobblestone streets of Paris interrupt the sleep of the working classes, and Mercier tells us that how many of the babies of Paris owe their birth to the result of the sudden passing rattle of wheels. While the gambling goes on, at 1 o'clock in the morning, 6,000 peasants arrive in the city, headed for, here we have the Palais Royal, where the prostitutes were out in force a little earlier in this day. And this, I should have shown you these images before. Here we have the various forms of fornication and relaxation and robbery occurring in the streets of Paris, or the gathering places of Paris. But in the morning, Here we are in Léal. 6,000 peasants arrive in the city headed for Léal, which is the central marketplace, a cacophonous hive of activity. Many of them at dawn will be finished their work in the market and will be headed back home to their villages. At 6 a.m., the bakers of the suburbs arrive at Léal with an enormous quantity of loaves. This is also the hour, 6 a.m., when workmen, as he says, take up their tools and trudge off to their day's labor, fortified by a cup of milky coffee, which is being distributed somewhere in this image. In the streets, they pass those emerging from a hard night of dissipation. The patrons of brothels and gambling dens make their shaky way home to sleep off their excesses until noon. So, Mercier's description, which I have provided for you in some detail, presents a series of different and distinct social groups carrying out a largely independent daily existence, moving at their different rhythms through the spatial, oral, and visual landscape of Paris. Mercier's Tableau de Paris is thus more of a literal table of distinct social groups rather than being a painting of a unified scene. And his point, of course, we should remember, is not so much empirical or realistic observation as it is the moral and political message that he derives from his account. How the Day Goes is a masterful set piece in Mercier's overall project of representing Paris as the capital of diversity, a series of islands of isolation whose social cohesion is undone and really damaged, undermined floors. The different social groups, as we've seen them throughout the day of Paris, encounter each other only indirectly, through the ghostly traces of the workmen's white footprints or through the rumbling carriage wheels of the rich. Time, of course, is at the center of the historian's craft. This is a truism valid for all fields of history, but somehow particularly salient in my field of history, which, as the title of my first book indicated, is the study of old regime France. The term Ancien Régime, or Old Regime, first surfaced actually just on the eve of the French Revolution in 1788 in a pamphlet that heralded the glorious new political system that would be inaugurated by the meeting of the Estates General called for 1789. It appeared first in English in 1792, and it has been conventionally translated since that date as Old Regime. This translation may give the misleading impression that the phrase Ancien Régime refers to the venerable age of the institutions and the traditions destroyed by the French Revolution. But instead, when revolutionaries used the term Ancien Régime, they actually did not mean ancient or old, but they meant former, Ancien Régime. And by subsuming the monarchical regime and its associated cultural, social, and fiscal systems under this rubric, the revolutionaries signaled their belief that they were witnessing, indeed that they themselves were creating, a whole new era of history. And their aspiration to a chronological tabula rasa only heightened with the subsequent radicalization of politics, leading the revolutionary government in 1794 to issue a new calendar. And here we have the revolutionary calendar, the Republican calendar, depicted for you in all its incredible complexity. And so with this tabula rasa, they began the world again at zero. Or in fact, as some of you may know, they began the year at 2, dating the dawn of a new age retroactively to the creation of the French Republic in 1792. So they declared the world begins in year 2. And this origin of the term Old Régime means that historians like myself, who work on 17th and 18th century France, work on a period that is defined a priori as rejected and vanquished. So to say that historians of the Old Regime have a teleology problem is quite an understatement. And the mode of time that has dominated historical writing about the 18th century has been, since the time of the Revolution, often that of anticipation. So following the work of Karl Marx, historians have tended to view the 18th century as a coiled spring poised to release the pent-up energies of a new era. A parallel mode of thinking by historians has been that of acceleration, the perception that as the currents of history approached the torrents of the Revolution, the pace of events flowed ever more swiftly toward their known and somehow inevitable destination. And you could note, for those interested in Britain or scholars of Britain, similar mode of thinking about the British Industrial Revolution. And so one of the key features of the onslaught of capitalist industrialization, as presented first by Marx and then in pioneering studies by E.P. Thompson and others, was this notion of an intensification and an acceleration of time imposed by longer and more frequent days of work with fewer holidays, and then by new technologies such as the mechanized, first the mechanized spinning and then mechanized weaving, and later by things like the railroad and the telegraph. And so the argument was not just that technology made production and other events, information transmission, happen more quickly, but that historical subjects' experience and apprehension of lived time was violently disrupted by the fundamental reorganization of labor introduced by industrialization. Now, inspired by everything I've said so far and by Mercier's attempt to capture a multiplicity of rhythms of time in one day of the life of Paris in the late 1780s, this talk, the rest of this talk, will invite you to think through the problem of time and its apprehension in the late 18th century, and to do so by attending to two distinct but interrelated, I argue, systems for ordering time, fashion, and credit. Another way to put this is to invite people who are interested in fashion and material culture to rethink those things as a question or a problem of time. So, with Mercier in mind, we turn finally to fashion, and I will use contemporary, that is to say 18th century, credit and fashion systems to track the experience, practice, and representation of time among Parisians in the years that Mercier was writing. And as we will see, there were indeed multiple measures for tracking time, what we might call multiple economies of time, not only among different social groups, that is to say, experienced differently by different social groups, but employed by the same individuals when engaged in different pursuits. You could live in multiple rhythms of time within one social group. And so by looking at the rhythms of fashion alongside and against those of credit, I will argue we may see how these economies of time bound social groups together across divides of wealth and status rather than merely dividing them, as Mercier's anecdote suggests. And indeed, how the control over these economies of time served as a technique of domination by wealthy and powerful people over those less wealthy and powerful. And I will make the further point that social control was not just an issue of the pace of time, as Thompson suggested, not just forcing people to work harder and faster, but also in the discordance or the asynchronicity between different methods of tracking time, forcing people, as we'll see, to live in contradictory modes of time. These findings shed new light on the power and economic dynamics at work in the exchanges that constituted what we call the consumer revolution of the 18th century. They provide new insight into the lived experience of the accelerating time, which has been seen as such an important characteristic of this period. And perhaps they inspire us to ask questions about the production and consumption of fashion and their relationship to time and power in our own age. Okay, so 3 sections will follow. In the first, we'll lay out the interrelated logic of time governing fashion and credit systems, in my view. Second, we'll talk about the time of fashion in the second half of the 18th century. And then finally, in the third section, we will talk about the time of credit. And as Jeff suggested in his introduction, we will contrast the slowness of credit and the stagnation of wages with the acceleration of fashion in the same period. So, to talk about, and we'll get to these two in just a second. Fashion and credit, in my view, and this is what I argue in my book, were both informal systems for assessing and according value, whose function lay primarily in the access that they allowed to other valued goods, tangible and intangible. So, in this view, it's not actually the possession of fashionable items in and for themselves that mattered. Instead, it was the status of being someone who was à la mode, someone who had the inside information and the financial means to achieve this status. And that's what produced cultural capital, which could in turn be converted to its social and political equivalents. And much of my book talks about conversions among social, economic, political, and cultural credit, and therefore between fashion and credit. And so, similarly, in the case of credit, it was not the possession of credit itself that mattered, but the commodities and money, or the influence and power that it enabled, as well as the further access to goods, social relations, and influence. To take this comparison further, both fashion and credit were constituted in large part by informal, anonymous, and collective, yet seemingly quite efficient systems for disseminating and evaluating information. Who had the authority in 18th century Paris to declare an item of clothing or a genre of literature or a word or a gesture, all things subject to fashion, to be of the latest fashion? Similarly, in the absence of financial institutions, there were no credit scores in 18th century France. Who decided how much debt an individual was capable of sustaining and reimbursing? In both of these cases, collective social judgments emerged based on information that circulated through asymmetric, hierarchical, semi-public networks. These networks were informal, but as I've emphasized, they were quite effective. And so historians had argued that in France, because there was no central bank, credit was very weak and didn't circulate very much, and historians have proven that that was mistaken. And in fact, there was a great deal of credit in circulation, and key figures, one study has shown, for example, were notaries, who had all the information about how much property people had, whether they paid back their debts, and they served a very important role as brokers for extending credit that made the economy function. And this is an informal but very efficient role they've shown that notaries played. In terms of fashion, France only has one very short-lived fashion journal until the 1780s, and yet it has a tremendously vibrant fashion industry, suggesting that informal visual witnessing sufficed for many decades to transmit news about the constant flow of new fashions. Of course, there were privileged informants, privileged nodes in these information systems. One, for example, the notaries that I've already mentioned. Another was the Parisian merchant and his or her retail boutique. And the merchant's expertise lay not only in making and selling fashionable goods, but also in keeping track of changing fashions, informing their clients about fashion, and also launching new fashions, the creation of fashion. An exceptionally adept practitioner of the trade was the fashion merchant Rose Bertin, and here she is, in one of the few surviving images of her. She carried enormous authority in declaring new styles. One of the styles we know she was responsible for is this dress worn by, this is the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, a portrait by Vigée Lebrun. This is called the robe à la chemise, created a scandal, as many of you know, when it was distributed at the Salon, because here we have the Queen of France dressed in informal, highly informal wear. This suggested to her by Rose Bertin. In neither the case of fashion nor of credit, and we'll come back to talk about Rose Bertin and Marie Antoinette in a little while, in neither case of fashion or credit could powerful knowledge brokers control the status of the many different objects and individuals at play in the system, nor did they possess, even someone like Rose Bertin did not possess complete and full information. Instead, limits on the circulation of information served as one means to construct social hierarchies and also to construct collective identities. Finding out what styles, what accessories, what colors remained in fashion, which ones were about to fade, which new ones were coming onto the scene, or who owed how much money to whom, how much were they likely to repay, and when were they going to be able to pay it. Finding out this information required significant investments of time, money, and social capital. Success or failure to do so had real consequences, both in material terms and also in terms of prestige, which translated again into influence and connections and other further rewards. So that's one set of commonalities between fashion and credit in their function as information systems. Another common feature was that they both hinged essentially on time. They were explicitly diachronic systems for ordering value. And no surprise to anyone that fashion's very basis was its ephemeral nature. A turn of speech or a color could only be considered fashionable to the extent that it had emerged from obscurity to occupy center stage, but would soon fade in favor of the next comer. Or Jeff's image of the wave is perhaps a more poetic, beautiful image. The short-lived nature of fashion drove elite consumption. Leading figures like the aristocratic Dorante in Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, which many of you may know, back to his tailor and back into debt, despite the fact that his clothes were surely not threadbare or irreparably soiled. Contemporaries often referred to, in French, la mode qui court and la mode qui trotte, literally the fashion which runs and the fashion which is trotting. Credit was also, as we know, fundamentally concerned with time. To speak only of one form of credit, shop credit, that is the purchase of, let's say, fashionable goods on account, like Dorante received from his tailor, and that his tailor used also to purchase raw materials from suppliers. This form of credit involved obtaining goods and services now, at the present moment, with the promise of payment in the future, guaranteed, supposedly, by a record of satisfactory borrowing and reimbursement in the past. So your past good behavior makes it possible to purchase in the present with the promise to pay in the future. And you might object that this is a kind of a difference between fashion and credit, because fashion needs to change, whereas credit is supposed to imply a kind of continuity over time in your behavior. However, even in this case, it was clear to observers that credit could never be fixed. It ebbed and flowed constantly. And canny merchants ensured that this was the case. One of their strategies is to multiply their suppliers, not rely too much on one, so that you can never be forced into bankruptcy when your supplier requests finally that your credit account be paid. You can juggle your credit among different suppliers. And so the trick was to track these shifting tides as closely as possible so that you did not extend credit today to somebody who no longer had the means to reimburse it. And so organic metaphors proliferate for both credit and fashion, reflecting the fact that they're fragile, ephemeral, that they live, they're born, they die. Contemporary sources not only speak frequently of the birth and death of fashions. One source from the late 17th century lamented the abortion of fashions caused by the death of a royal that drove the court into mourning, so they all abandoned or aborted the fashions that they would have taken on. An early 18th century dictionary speaks of the flowering of credit, the potential for credit, just like fashion, to be out of season. Credit can go out of season. Many other contemporary sources talk about the growth, the failing of credit. And the most striking organic metaphor, which was actually very widespread, and you can find quite a few images of it, is the death of credit. And so there's a lot of French engravings, and they exist for other countries. Le crédit est mort, credit is dead, which referred to a sudden, sharp credit crisis in which nobody wanted to extend credit anymore. We talked a lot here so far about the relationship between credit and fashion and their situation in time. Let's turn to the second element that I said I would talk about, which is this theme of acceleration. And so if fashion is based in time, a standard trope is that of the constant acceleration of fashion. And this is nothing new to the 18th century. Some of you may work on earlier periods or later periods, and as you all know, whenever anyone evokes fashion, everybody complains that it's going faster and faster than it ever has before. That's the constant thing of fashion, is it's constantly speeding up. In 18th century France, there's some reason for believing that at least at that moment there was some truth to the claim. And so historians of what has been called the consumer revolution of the 18th century describe a very important shift in consumption patterns, starting in some places in the late 17th century and picking up speed across the 18th century. There are many factors involved, including quickly population growth, urbanization, as I've argued in my first book, the tremendous rise of skilled female labor in the garment trades, particularly seamstresses, colonial production, often worked by enslaved people, technological innovations, new attitudes, etc. Together, these greatly increased the consumption of finished goods. Wealthy women, and at least in Paris, according to Danielle Roche, to a lesser extent men, expanded and renewed their wardrobes more quickly. Their secondhand clothing, as well as cheaper imitations of luxury goods, what one historian has called populux goods, bring fashion into the reach of ordinary people for the first time. And so, to give one example, historians have shown that silk manufacturers in Lyon responded to and encouraged the faster pace of fashion by making silk that was thinner and therefore cheaper, so consumers could afford to change more often. Another example, one of the attractions of linen and cotton that come into fashion is comfort, and you can wash it, but also they're cheaper, so you can renew your garments more frequently. And just to give you, and here we have an image of the seamstress, fashion merchant here, bringing the latest wares of the consumer revolution. This is an image by Boucher, of course, from 1749. And we have all these little trinkets and decorations, trimmings of dresses that form such an important part of women's apparel in this period. Here we have the proliferation of hats. Fashion merchants are responsible for the garments of the head and shoulders. They make hats, and they sell shawls and other items like capes. But they also are responsible for the trimmings of the dress. So the seamstress will sew the actual garment, but it's the fashion merchant who supplies the much more lucrative trade of the trimmings of the dress. And in 18th century fashion, the surface of the dress really is the most important carrier of the fashionability of the dress. Contemporary sources allow us to gauge perceptions and realities of this process of acceleration. And so to give you some examples from the periodical press, In the late 17th century, there was one periodical called the Mercure Galant that provided regular reports on fashion, and it actually gives us a surprisingly sophisticated fashion system dominated by the court, but very much influenced by the commercial world of Paris, even open to the influence of street fashion. But it was largely framed by the seasons, with an occasional acknowledgement of some blip in the seasonal pattern, but it was mostly acknowledged by the weather conditions and the court calendar of the seasons. But if we fast forward 100 years to the second half of the 18th century, fashion reporting continues to note seasonal trends, but it also suggests a more rapid cycle of innovation. And so the Mercure Galant had quarterly supplements that concentrated on fashion, and we see in 1768 the short-lived Courrier des Modes, the first dedicated fashion journal, is published every month. By 1785, the second big fashion journal, the Cabinet des Modes, appeared every 2 weeks, and by 1786 this is accelerated to every 10 days. So fashion considered to be worth reporting on more frequently. Satirical literature insisted on an even faster pace of renewal. A facetious proposal for an Academy of Fashion, published in 1777 in a newspaper, said that this Academy of Fashion should have daily rulings on new styles, and their rulings should be published in a gazette that would appear 3 times a week. And in October, a fictitious letter to the editor in this newspaper explained that there were something like 10,000 privileged hairstylists. They had a privilege from the king to be hairstylists. And the letter claims they appointed deputies among their ranks on a rotating basis to scour the boulevards, public walkways, the dance halls, and spectacles of Paris, looking for attractive new styles, like in the New York Times, the street scene on the street. And a sketch artist went with each deputy to capture the new looks, and they met every night in the cellar of a wine merchant to share around their findings. And as of the very next morning, hairstylists would offer the results of the new looks they had found, and they would pay royalties to the association of 2 shillings for every use of the new look within 6 days of the sighting, but only 1 sou in the next 6 days, and then afterwards it was free, and the letter notes the hairstyle being considered outdated after 12 days. There's also a postscript advertising the next issue of a hairstyling magazine, making it clear that this is a plug for the hairstyling magazine. But we may trace here is just some satirical images of the heights of women's hairstyles in the same period. We can trace the chronological process of diffusion through one fascinating example. On July 17th, 1788, 2 ambassadors of the Indian ruler Tipu Saib arrived in Paris with their retinue after a journey from the arrival port on the Mediterranean. So it was not a giraffe, as Michelle has told us about, but the ambassadors of the ruler himself. They began to appear in public near the end of July. They were formally received at Versailles by the king on August 10th. 10 days later, the August 20th issue of the Magasin des Modes Nouvelles declared that a vogue in Indian styles would surely soon sweep the country, and on August 30th, it proudly declared that it had been correct by offering engravings of the new robe à la Tipu Saib and the redingote à l'indienne, inspired by this visit. According to the same journal, more fashions were produced by this visit all the way through September 20th, so 20 days later, when the journal printed an engraving of a woman dressed in a harem robe. By September 10th, 1788, the London newspapers were reporting the robe à la Tipu Saib as the latest Paris vogue. But 2 weeks later, barely, its credit had dissipated because the issue of the Magasin des Modes Nouvelles for September 30th referred now to the latest Chinese turban bonnet. And it made no mention of the Indians. And in fact, in early November, the editors said, it is no longer the Indians who give rise to fashion. Since they have left Paris, fashions only owe their name and their form to the taste and imagination of marchands, that is, female fashion merchants, or sometimes to the taste and imagination of sectaries or benevolent authors of fashion. 6 weeks had passed between the ambassador's arrival in Paris and the appearance in print of a woman dressed in the garments they inspired, but in total, Tipu Saib's reign of fashion apparently lasted only 1 month. One master of the rhythms of fashion, of the time of fashion, was Rose Bertin, official fashion merchant to Marie Antoinette. She visited the queen 2 or 3 times a week at Versailles to create, to fit, and to deliver new fashions. And she used this status to play with her client's desire to acquire the latest fashions created for the queen as quickly as possible. So there's a great anecdote reported in the underground literature in April 1778, which said, a woman of quality comes to ask from this Miss Bertin several bonnets to send back home to the provinces. The merchant, lying on her chaise longue in an elegant caraco jacket, scarcely deigned to greet the woman of quality with a very faint nod of her head. She rings. A charming young nymph named Mademoiselle Adélaïde presents herself. "Give, madame," says Mademoiselle Bertin, "the month-old bonnets." The lady informs her that she would like newer ones. "That is not possible, madame," responds the merchant. "In my last work with the queen, we agreed that the most recent bonnets would not appear before 1 week." This drove the women of quality insane, of course, being treated this way by a humble merchant. Bertin thus played heavily on her role as a creator of new fashions for her royal patron, manipulating the tension between publicity and secrecy involved in their invention and dissemination. Many fashion merchants and other retail merchants laid claim to possessing the latest styles. Bertin's power lay in her capacity to dictate new styles through her influence at court and her capacity to show or hide the new fashions from her elite clients. And so the rhythms of fashion in the second half of the 18th century are monthly, weekly, even daily. This is, of course, most available to the elite who order custom-made garments, but it is displayed not just to the reading public purchasing fashion journals, but also to those at court, and the royal court is open to any decently dressed person, and also to the common people strolling in the public gardens that Mercier and others referred to, the Palais Royal, the Tuileries, the new boulevards, and there are many comments in the anecdotal literature about the difficulty one had and the embarrassment in trying to distinguish now between a duchess and a milkmaid. So similarly were they attired. So if we now switch in the final section of the talk to the means of paying for this wonderful accelerating array of fashions, we perceive, of course, a starkly different rhythm. Like other merchants, and this is very well established by a number of different historians, retail and wholesale trade happens with the crushing majority on credit. And so fashion merchants, like everybody else, sell on credit, and they also buy their supplies on credit. The queen herself pays Rose Bertin infrequently at best. She submitted a bill to the royal household in October 1791, and Bertin included about 3,500 pounds for 3 years of interest on more than 22,000 pounds or livres that were still owing to her. She also noted 4,500 livres of interest on more than 45,000 pounds that were due her from 1789. The Queen's household doesn't pay all of this, but it does pay a fraction of the interest. And in fact, when Bertin dies in 1813, her heirs claim that she has accounts outstanding worth 1,500,000 pounds by her clients who have not paid her. She in turn owes 500,000 to her suppliers and her workers. And one example allows us, one little case study allows us to get closer to this dynamic of credit. A woman named Marie-Angélique Françoise Taschereau de Baudry, who we will call by her married name, Madame de Bercy. She was a daughter of an important royal bureaucrat, an intendant of finances, and a lieutenant general of police, a man described in a contemporary memoir as a man dishonored and of scandalous wealth. The claim was when he died, he left 500,000 gold écus coins, or 3 million pounds, hidden in his home in 1755. 2 decades earlier, in 1734, he had married his daughter with a dowry of 400,000, and I'm emphasizing these figures so that we'll see their comparison to the amounts charged by her merchants. 400,000 livres dowry. He married her to a man who was another important royal officer, grandson of the former Controller General or Finance Minister of Louis XIV. And their home, the Château de Bercy, became a very important site of worldly gatherings in Paris. The Musée Galliera in Paris has a collection of the bills of Madame de Bercy, furnished by purveyors of her clothing and accessories, not her cloth merchants, though. They extend from the year of her wedding to her old age, and they show us the rhythms of time and also the dynamic of power running through her credit relations. In this period, Madame de Bercy ordered a little bit more than, on average, 8 new dresses every year, custom-made and custom-decorated dresses. And by modern terms, try this on your Visa card. They were very generous. Most purveyors presented her with an annual bill, not a monthly bill, meaning that they had to wait up to a year to be paid for some orders. And in many cases, the period was even longer. So, based on my calculations, for 551 orders charged to her account, the average number of days between the date the charge was noted and the date the payment was received was 605 days. The bills, let me see. Okay, I'll just skip a little bit in the interest of time. There were variations in her, how long she took. For example, there's a famous precursor to Rose Bertin, Mademoiselle Duchat, fashion merchant. The average interval in her payment to her was about 196 days. So to a powerful fashion merchant, she waits a little bit less long. But to her seamstress, she makes her wait on average more than 8 months to be paid. Another fashion merchant, less famous, who works for her later in her life, has to wait about 3.5 years for her bills to be paid. And her seamstress, who worked for her from 1757 to 1772, sewing all these dresses, she also had to wait on average a little over 3 years after she submitted her bill to be paid. And so the contrast between the wealth of this family and their reluctance to pay is remarkable. With a dowry of reportedly 400,000 livres, it took her 300 days to pay less than 400 livres charged by her fashion merchant for the items in her trousseau. 15 years later, the memoir that I cited earlier claimed that her husband had paid a 300,000 livre bribe for a political scandal he was involved in. Contrast this largesse with the 96 livres that his wife paid to her seamstress in the same year to pay for orders that had been delivered many months earlier. And in fact, an order that she received that was only 6 or almost 7 pounds in the same year was not paid for more than 2 years. So Rose Bertin was in a strong enough position to insist on interest. Not only did the purveyors of Madame de Bercy not get interest, but routinely her household refuses to pay the full amount of the bill. They're imposing reductions on the bill when they actually get around to paying it a year, 2 or 3 years later. And if the time of credit was much slower moving, that's sort of an understatement, than the time of fashion, the time of workers' wages was apparently utterly stagnant. In 1735, her seamstress charged Madame de Bercy 6 pounds for making a dress, and between 1.5 and 3 pounds for making a skirt. The wages that she received for that labor were exactly the same 30 years later. And so when she switched to a new seamstress in 1757, 30 years later, she actually paid her less. This is a period, those of you who know 18th century history, prices for food and rent skyrocketed in Paris during this time, while the labor of a seamstress earned no more than it had 30 years earlier. So there's a very significant loss in real income. This may seem extreme, but it is confirmed by the larger historiography on retail trades in Paris. They also find an echo in the account books deposited with the commercial court of Paris by fashion merchants when they declared bankruptcy. And this was something I studied in some detail in my book. These account books show similarly long delays, partial payments, reductions imposed by noble and wealthy households. And the sources, like those from Madame de Bercy, the bankruptcy sources show that far from having interest charges implicit in price, and this is the common assumption both of contemporary literature and of current historiography, that credit worked because the prices were higher, because interest charges were implicit. When I did the statistical analysis of the account books, I found that in many cases, the prices that they charged were insufficient to cover the cost of the materials they were purchasing from their suppliers. And we can talk in the questions about why and how this worked, etc. But just I'll move on so we can get to the questions. The time of fashion, therefore, bore obviously only a very partial resemblance to the time of credit that paid for it. And we should remember that this is also a time when artisans, like seamstresses and fashion merchants, are often, during seasonal rushes, asked to work harder. So instead of the normal 12 to 13-hour workday that Mercier described for us at the opening, and that is confirmed in archival sources, they would be asked to stay up all night to get the ball gown finished, to get the hat done for the latest event. And historians have also shown that the consumer revolution was accompanied by a significant shift in the number of working days. And so, for example, in London, one scholar very creatively used court testimony to figure out which days, where the people were and what they were doing. The witnesses have to say where they were on certain days. And he finds there's a rise, first of all, that the loss of the traditional Saint Monday, when you could get drunk and you didn't have to go to work, that is lost. Many feast days during the calendar year are also lost. And so he finds a rise from 208 working days in the 1750s to 306 days around 1880s. And so the working people of London, and presumably also Paris, were losing sleep, not just to the roll of carriage wheels in the night, but to actually being in the workforce, working harder than they ever had before. The time of making and displaying fashion, the time of displaying prestige, which is in itself a form of cultural credit, this time was crucial. The time of paying tradesmen's debts was not important, apparently, at all. And we can imagine, as Jeff evoked it in the introduction, the difficulties in making someone pay for a hat that was in style for a few weeks or a few months or a few days, 2 or 3 years later. And if the style itself failed, if the launch of the new fashion did not work, this could make clients even more reluctant to pay. Fashion merchants and their elite clients were bound in shared risks, as they were bound in the shared time of conceiving and producing and consuming fashions, but the burden of risk and of time fell much more heavily on the merchant. They seem to occupy two historiographical points simultaneously. The modern consumer time and the modern capitalist work time, evoked by a historian, constantly accelerating and intensifying, but in terms of their wages and credit, they seem mired in the traditional moral economy with its traditional unmoving just price. And I think I'll stop there and we can move on to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very rich. And now the floor is open for questions and comments and reactions. including tweeted ones if we have any, but let's start with the real ones. Please. Why don't you, since you can see better, why don't you just choose your...
Oh, sorry, yeah, okay.
Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
Is there any difference in the time and extent of credit available among different classes? I know we're talking about an elite audience,
Yeah.
but is there a difference between the very highest aristocracy and the queen? That's obviously a different category than a wealthy city dweller or someone on low aristocracy. So is there a difference in the kind of credit available?
Yeah, so there are many different answers. That's a great question. It is easier, of course, to get credit if you are perceived to have a greater capacity to repay. And so there's a French saying of the period, credit only extends to the second or the third floor, because at this time in Paris, social distinction is often vertical, so you get poorer and poorer as you go up. It stops at a certain level. So, of course, there is a distinction in how much credit and who gets credit. Having said that, that's not actually a completely accurate saying, because we also know that even ordinary, humble people relied on credit for their daily purchases. There's a great book by a woman named Julie Hardwick where she goes into some detail on this, and there's studies of England as well, that, for example, everybody dies owing money to the baker, they owe money to the wine merchant, they owe money to their landlord, they owe money in these small artisanal households, they will owe money to their journeymen, they owe money to the nurses and doctors who care for them, and to the apothecaries. And so credit is actually a very important, vital mechanism of consumption and exchange and sale at all levels of society. And just one last detail, I did, with these account books, I was trying to answer this question for the fashion merchants customers. What is it, because the account books don't really speak about how does the merchant make a decision about who to give credit to. And in fact, there's one account book, there's actually a number of account books where they don't know the name of the woman that they're giving the credit to. So 3 livres owed to me by a woman whose name I don't know, literally, or the friend of the person who lives down the street. And so I tried to control statistically for the variables in the clients, and I did not find that having a noble title actually was what made it possible for you to have a longer credit, and also for you to get excused from paying, because many of these customers in the end, when they pay, it says in the account book paid in full, but if you actually, I know more about their businesses now than they ever did, because I have, statistical methods which they never thought to use. So they would write paid in full, and when you add up the figures, it was not paid in full. It was significantly reduced. What affects that? Noble status does not seem to be important. What seems to be more important is how much you owed. So the more faithful of a client you were, the larger the bill you had, the more leverage you had to force down the rates. Which probably makes sense. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Thank you.
Yes?
I have a question. First, I thank you for the talk, and I am in awe of the historian, mathematician identity that you possess. I have a question that is a gender question.
Sure.
So isn't it the case that these women, seriously, not the reine, not the queen, but others were in double debt, that they were in debt to potentially a shopkeeper and also to their spouse?
Oh, the women.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just wonder if there were issues there in terms of implications of debt, especially for women, because of this status problem, in the economy, that clearly men had a position in the economy of being possession of money where women probably did not. I'm assuming.
Sure.
I think that was the case in France.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah.
So I just wonder how this got, worked out. If somebody actually prosecuted, how is a woman's identity then implicated in this complex system?
That's a wonderful question. And in fact, I've written a whole chapter of the book is exactly about this. So what's fascinating about credit is that the historiography on women and women's economic agency has always emphasized, this is the case of England and also the case of France, the fact that married women are in coverture, that they do not have financial autonomy. In France has many different law codes, but let's say the Law Code of Paris, which is the most important, when a woman marries, she retains her ownership of her property, and it will go back to her children when she dies. Spouses don't inherit from each other, children do. But it falls within the complete control and authority of her husband. She no longer has authority over that money. And so they will say women can't form debt because they're not allowed to. They can't sign the contract. But what's fascinating about credit is that shop credit, it's a completely informal kind of debt that needs no authorization whatsoever. And in fact, the legal treatises explicitly tell you that there is a loophole for married women to purchase on credit given the needs for women to provision the family. So that means, the legal treatise says, when a woman buys on credit, it is assumed that she is buying with the authority of her husband and with his permission, because that is her role, is to provision the family. And so I argue in the book, in the late 17th century, when the guy wrote that, or in the mid 17th century, fine. When you have a consumer revolution and now all of a sudden you have this fantastic stuff that women can buy on credit, then you have women running up thousands of tens and tens of thousands in debt that they are technically allowed to, but of course that they probably shouldn't be. And so part of my argument is that one understudied or understood element of the marital relationship is a woman's access to her husband's credit. And that is part of their relationship. And so there's a whole literature that accompanies the consumer revolution in the late 18th century, displaying the anxieties about these young, noble women whose husbands are away doing whatever, and the women go crazy, and they're buying all this stuff, and there's often a Rose Bertin-like figure who appears and is like, hey, check out this new stuff, don't you want it? And she's like, oh, I shouldn't, but I really do, and she buys, and then the servants come and say, you haven't paid me for months, the creditors are at the door, what am I supposed to do? And the fear is the husband will arrive, and it won't be a legal problem, but it will be a marital problem, and the worst thing is he'll exile her to the estates where she can't buy, and there's nothing to buy. And gambling is always wrapped up in this, because these profligate noble women in the literature have gambling debts, and they also have consumer debts. And there's a kind of pedagogical impulse to teach elite young women how to use credit properly, which I argue is produced by the fact that the men have no legal power to actually stop them from doing that. So. Hello? Yes.
What's the role of the second-hand market in all of this?
Oh, the second-hand market is a huge, huge market that I have not probably studied enough. There's a woman named Laurence Fontaine for France who has written a lot about the second-hand market. And so the second-hand market is a really important way for fashionable luxury goods to make their way to the hands of women lower down the social scale. And so the second-hand market most ordinary women are buying their clothes on the second-hand market, not going to a seamstress, because cloth is tremendously expensive. But where those ordinary women can invest a little bit is, that the stylishness, the robe à la française doesn't really change very much for a long period of time, and so ribbons are relatively inexpensive, and so you can buy things to make your hat have the right colors or to look more fashionable. But second-hand market is really a very important element, and there are many women involved in the second-hand market as well.
And does credit extend there?
To the second-hand market? Yeah. And in fact, second-hand clothes serve as there's a lot of pawning that goes on as well. And so clothing is a way to obtain credit in some ways. It sells on credit and you buy it on credit, but it is also really important. And so when you see people arrested for theft, a lot of times what they're stealing is cloth or clothing, which they can sell for money. And people pawn, they pawn their snuff boxes and their watches, but they also pawn clothing. Yes?
Did you find major changes after fashion and credit after 1789, or the same old tradition continued?
I argue argue that it really continues. It's going to get complicated later on in the 19th century when you have, it's not going to change quickly, but after the mid 19th century, when the sewing machine, when you have mechanization of sewing, that is going to change things quite a bit. But the revolution is supposed to introduce austerity and this classical, sort of neoclassical style, and that goes away very, very quickly. And the court life takes off, and Napoleon wants to bring back fashion. And when the Bourbons are restored, the first thing that the new king, after the restoration, says is, "Where is Rose Bertin?" And he says, "I need Rose Bertin because he has a lot of legitimacy issues, obviously. If I'm going to have a court," he says, "Where is Mademoiselle Bertin?" My understanding is, if I'm going to have a court which is recognized as a court, I need the person who can dress my court and who can bring back this sort of legitimacy. And so, but we have fashion account books from dressmakers to the imperial court that look very much the same. And so the credit relations, I think, function very much in the same way. I argued in the seamstress book that the destruction of the abolition of the guilds hurts female labor, because while you have a seamstresses guild, you have a kind of special position for women, and it's apprenticeship by mistresses in their home. There's an association, and the guild mistresses represent the guild to the officials of Paris and also to the crown, and that gives a kind of status to women's work that is going to disappear over time. And so I think, I try to argue in that book, there's a kind of, it's really a double-edged sword, because having a seamstresses guild provides provides a kind of institutionalization of women's labor, which is helpful in some way, but it also legitimates and sort of perpetuates the kind of essentialist thinking that what women should be doing is sewing, and that's all they should do. So it sort of cuts both ways.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I wanted to, I liked your sort of analogy of Rose Bertin as the knowledge broker, or sort of these fashion merchants. And I'm thinking about the sort of other knowledge brokers at the time, who are the publishers and the printers and the sort of people who are involved in the production of fashion press, and the sort of the explosion of not just fashion knowledge, but the idea that books and pamphlets and periodicals can also be published much more rapidly throughout the 18th century. So I'm wondering how that sort of factors in terms of, is it really just that fashions are changing as fast, or is it that there's this sort of multiplicity of ways that people can get the news?
Exactly. That's a very good question. And the relationship between representations of fashion getting faster and fashion actually getting faster are, of course, vexed and difficult. And it would not do to simply read from the representations onto that's how fashion worked. So I think it's a very complicated relationship. And I think you're definitely right to say that really, really important is the rise of this print media in Paris, but also in the rest of Western Europe, and that's equally important as whatever is actually going on in the fashion world. I do think that there is lots of evidence of acceleration in the actual production and consumption of things, but I think the proliferation of media about it is equally important. And what's really fascinating to me when I was studying the fashion merchants is how much emphasis there is in the contemporary press and in the encyclopédie, for example, different levels of publishing on the terminology of the fashion merchants. And so they are talking not so much about the actual hat that's new, what they are poking fun at and mentioning all the time is all the different words and labels that and if we go back to these hat, you don't see the captions on here, but if I had the captions, they always give you the ridiculous, the hedgehog hat and the Sultan's hat and the whatever. And they and one of these, but alluding to the title, there's a Sultan's hat somewhere. And what you notice when you look at the list is it bears absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to the actual object. If you had a list of the titles of the hedgehog thing and the whatever, you couldn't really match it up to any of these things.
Don't
So
they even comment on that?
they commented all the time, and so the argument that I make is the production of cultural knowledge about these things, it's the production of the information about fashion is as important in some ways as the actual items themselves. And knowing the names of all this stuff is partly what you need to know. And I mean, some of it is satirical and it's funny, but I also think that genuinely, when you go to the fashion merchant's shop, you would ideally like to be able to say, I would like the XY, I would like the harem dress, or I invented the harem dress, not, well, could you make me something kind of that thing I saw with the red? Knowing the names of things is an important, prestigious thing to know. And to know them, you have to be in the right place. You have to, I live in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, and this is New York. So when I come to New York, I have to know where's the shop that I have to go to, what is the thing I should buy? Should I buy this thing which nobody's going to be wearing anymore? But if I take it home, will anybody really know what it is? So it's a similar, unfortunately, I'm the lady from the provinces, it's a similar dynamic of the knowledge, being on the place to know is really important, and that's the thirst that is being served and stoked up by this rising print media.
But we have Twitter, so.
We have,
Which isn't working tonight, but.
oh, that's okay. In fact,
Did Bertin stay in France during the revolution as a terror?
Bertin is an incredibly smart woman. All these movies about Marie Antoinette should be movies about Rose Bertin. She, in 1792, she continues to serve the Queen after the attempted flight to Varennes. When they're in prison, she's still going up until 1791 to give the Queen new dresses. If she'd been around in 1793, all those pathetic images of the Queen's rags that she wears, she would have had a much better outfit, probably. But in 1792, Bertin gets scared, rightfully, and she's associated with all of these aristocrats, and she's always bragged about how she's friends with some of them. She goes to dinner at their place. She has a country house. She has a carriage. She has servants in livery. So 1792, she goes to the royal government, and she says, I have this problem, and that's how I have the figures about how much is owed to her and her debts. She says, I owe 500,000. I am owed 1,500,000. I need to pay my sans culotte workers, ouvriers sans culotte. I need to pay them. So please let me go to Koblenz, which is the heart of émigré life, so that I can collect money from the princes and princesses whose heads you would soon like to cut off. And they give her a passport, and they allow her to go. And she goes, and once she's gone and things get more radical, they put her name on the list of the émigrés. And she has, she never marries, and her nieces, she marries them off to officers, but her nephews are running the business. And she has one nephew whose only job is to get her name off the list. So he gets her off the list once, and then later on her name goes on again, and he succeeds in keeping her name off the list of the émigrés. She's in Koblenz, she goes to London, she travels around quite a bit. She faces competition from her former clients who are impoverished and set themselves up as fashion merchants because it's one of the only things they know how to do. And she returns in 1813 and she dies shortly afterwards. She's lost all her money and it's kind of sad. But she survives the revolution and she does quite well. Yes, Jeff?
I echo Nina's comment about the economic skills that you showed, so I hate to even get into this territory, but I think that you've explained something for me tonight that I never really understood, and I just want to talk it through and you tell me if it's right. One of the questions I've always had, reading similar statistics, is why on earth did people extend so much credit to others that they knew very well was a risk, and that they would only get pennies on the dollar or certainly, not the entire amount. But I think your perspective of basically asking in what ways were these two time conceptions linked? In what ways were these communities linked? The sense I got was very much like the Rose Bertin case, that you only pay people back if they can continue to offer you something that you want, right? So it's not about what you owe, it's about what they can do for you next. And I just wonder, is that something that we've underestimated as a driver in the sense of the fashion system or of the actual production of new styles, innovations? It's, we love to talk about how they changed and innovated because customers always wanted to buy new stuff. But I wonder if it's more profound, and that the reason, let's say a supplier has a debt to a manufacturer or a craftsman, and the only way that that debt is going to be paid is if that craftsman invents something new that his customers want, because that's the only way his customers are going to fear him and pay him, and that's the only way he's going to get paid. And I wonder then, is that why someone ships, mahogany logs to the same guy that owes you money?
Well,
Because
if they go
the only way
down,
you're going to get it back. And then
people
is
are
that
desperate
why
for
you
other
extend
people
credit
not
to the
to-
fashionable person?
Yes. I
And then they
mean,
come to your shop, even though you lose money on him, but you're going to get
you
it.
have to keep doing it because the thing, as we found out, a few years ago, that keeps the whole thing running is confidence and belief. And once that starts, there are a number of credit crises in the 18th century, sharp panics when all of a sudden it stops, and the most famous, the South Sea Bubble, and it can stop. And once it stops, then everybody is in terrible trouble because nobody can cover their debts if everybody calls them in at once. But that's why the supplier, it's in his interest to help the retailer keep going, because if his retailer starts going bust and people find out that his retailer can't pay him back anymore, then he's going to lose his own credit.
I guess that I always intuited, but you just
Yeah.
clarified it in a way that connected it with innovation in a way that was new for me. So I want to ask you another question, because I've spent some time in archives reading pleas by debtors to be paid back. In my
Yeah.
case, it was often money that was owed by the Pope or the papal administration. So the language of those pleas is very much, oh, Holy Father, in your
Exactly.
enormous mercy. And, it's an appeal to the moral economy that
Exactly.
you invoked at the end of your talk. The implication is, how unseemly would it be, Holy Father, if you, the distributor of heavenly mercy, didn't pay your
Exactly.
poor tradesmen? But what is the language that when it comes to shove, right? What is the language, because there must be letters that you've come across saying, you need to pay me and this is why,
Yeah.
reading behind the
Yeah.
lines. How do they argue that in this
Well,
economy?
there's I actually haven't come across as many. The letters don't survive in the kinds of records that I have, but I have come across a few. So in the Madame de Bercy archive, there's one really sad, little pathetic letter from the seamstress who gets paid the same thing for 30 years, and she says, Dear Madame, please forgive me and don't find this, terribly an imposition from me, but would it be possible for me to ask you for an advance on what you owe me? Which the language of an advance on what you owe me, so she already owes her the money, but it's not the time to present the bill, but she desperately needs the money. I hope you will not find it wrong of me to be so bold as to make this request. And they grant her some portion of it.
But does she tie it to current work? I mean, how does she get around that problem of how does she get the payer's self-interest motivated?
This case, it was pity and almost charity. Please, I beg you, I need the money. The Rose Bertin correspondence, which I would love to do something with one day, she dies and her heirs are left holding all this paper, the accounts, which in the French commercial court, the account book can be used as evidence if it's properly kept, and she has all these volumes, and they tried to collect it, but it's now 1820, 1830, even into the 1840s. The lawyers are going around knocking on doors. Are you the Marquis de whatever? Oh no, I'm not the Marquis. My father was guillotined, or we lost everything. Well, that's a different branch of the family, but they're arguing over hundreds, of very small, sometimes amounts of money, and those letters say she never pressed anyone for money. She always gave the most generous credit because she was an honorable merchant and she trusted in the honor of these families, and she made a point of pride never to press any of her clients for money, but here we are in this horrible situation, and we trust to the honor of your family that you will make good on this debt. And then they write back saying, of course, we would love to do this for us, it's very important, we really want to do it, and yet, no, sorry, there's no money, we can't do it. And so, I mean, I tried to balance the statistical, they're not paying, with the literary, which is, Madame, the creditors are at the door, they're all knocking, what do you want me to tell them? And they are pressing, and they are being, and the question of whether women had a harder time collecting their debts is one that I don't, there's somebody says somewhere, those women were in the power of their husbands, therefore I could not make them pay. That is, the female clients, I could not make them pay, which goes against my argument, so I've decided that that's not representative. But it is clear that the women don't suffer getting access to credit, so I did a comparison by gender or whatever. The female retailers are getting credit the same way that men are, so that doesn't seem to be a problem. But the extent to which an aristocrat would feel, I mean, the old saying is, a gambling debt is a debt of honor that you have to pay immediately. A debt to a tradesman is not. Your honor is not impugned by what you owe a tradesman. And yet, if 15 or 20 of them are knocking at the door, but there's a great book by Natasha Coquery, all of the aristocrats were completely in debt. They all owed money to all of their provisioners, and that was just completely standard. So I think it was the culture of debt and credit was just like today, it was everywhere. Everybody owed money to somebody, and everybody was owed money. That's just how it
Except that we live in terror of Visa and MasterCard, so.
Well, now we have credit scores, right? They didn't have credit cards. There were no credit
Anyway,
scores.
you've given us so much to think about, and we can continue the conversation and questions over some refreshments, so let me thank you again.